psychic hearing, spirit visitations, psychic animals. Are you curious? It's all on this episode of Curious Explorers. All right, so hi everyone. Welcome to another episode of Curious Explorers. I'm Traci Stein. I'm here with my incredibly fabulous co-host with the most, the Kathy A. Kelly.
Hello.
So Kathy, first of all, so great to see you because, you've been kind of off exploring all kinds of things, mysterious, haunted, historical. I don't know how much of that you want to share, but I let people know in our last few episodes about your new venture with Adam Berry, the Adam Berry.
The Adam Berry. Yeah, it's true. I mean, I have been very fortunate to do a little bit of traveling in the beginning of this summer. As pretty much everything, and you know this, everything kind of leans into the paranormal for me. So I've done a few investigations that hopefully I'll be bringing to you and to our audience. Some of them really interesting, and some of them I think tie in with some historical stuff that I think you'll really enjoy. But it's nice to be back in home base and at Paranormal Tower and actually sitting here, essentially virtually across from you having our usual crazy conversations.
Yay. Well, I'm so excited to see you. And we were joking before we went on air, so to speak. This is the first time either one of us has seen you tan.
Yeah, that's exactly. It's the first time I've ever been tan. And everyone, I'm looking at it now. I look pink, but guys, this is me savagely tan. I'm so proud of a watch band that I actually have. I'm very, very proud of that. Yeah, I finally welcomed the sun into my life.
I think Band de Soleil and Coppertone probably won't be sponsoring our
they're
program.
not going to be reaching out.
They're going to be like, these two are not really.
Solar cane maybe, but not, not those.
Really. So sad. But you look great. Thank you. I wanted to talk about a topic today that you and I, of course, have talked about. I'm going to name a few people, and I want you to tell me if you know what they have in common, okay? Because they seem like they wouldn't have a lot in common, but they do. All right. Thomas Edison, kind of. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. His wife, Lady Doyle. We may as well include her. Joan of Arc and the prophet Elijah. What do they have in common?
So I do know what they have in common.
Of course
and
you
some
do.
Some of them have more in common than more deeply into that. But they've all had auditory experiences that we would call clairaudience. Conan Doyle and his wife and a couple of the other ones were also all members of the Ghost Club, went from their clairaudience into kind of an investigative realm because of them, but they heard things.
They certainly did. And what I'd like to do is just give our audience who might not be historians such as you are, or they might be, who knows, but I would like to tell people a little bit about how I am grouping these people together in a clairaudient club. So Thomas Edison, I actually don't know if he heard anything, had any sort of clairaudient communications, but I do know that in 1920, supposedly he announced plans to develop something he referred to as a spirit phone to help people connect with the dead, presumably through audio phenomena. So interestingly, for those who recognize the name, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, but aren't putting it together, he wrote, among other things, Sherlock Holmes, who's also a physician. I don't know if everybody knows that, but he and his wife, Lady Doyle, lost a son. The son died from, I believe, pneumonia after being wounded in a battle in 1916.
Right.
And so I'm not sure exactly if they directly heard from him or heard from him through a medium, but they became pretty committed spiritualists. And in fact, a little aside from there, they became good friends with Harry Houdini, who was a staunch skeptic. And supposedly Lady Doyle heard from Houdini's mother after she passed away, but Houdini refused to believe this. And I think ultimately the friendship dissolved, but I digress. Joan of Arc heard voices of saints advising her regarding battle plans. That didn't go well. She was burned at the stake for being a heretic. I guess the consolation prize was being made a saint. I'm sure people accuse me of being a heretic now, but often people don't respond well to other people hearing things clairaudiently. I'm no biblical scholar. but also the prophet Elijah is reported to have heard God's voice whispering to him. And Kathy, you can name, I'm sure, a number of other people, biblical or otherwise, who have heard communications. Clairaudience means clear hearing. It's psychic hearing. So it's hearing anything from voices to other auditory phenomena, environmental noises, music, and so forth that other people usually don't hear. But that often lead to verifiable information later on that the person could not have known at the time they heard this information. Want to make that distinction because we'll talk about the difference between psychosis and clairaudience a little later in this episode.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're talking about is it's evidentiary, right? So what people are experiencing or hear can later be verified as something that they could not have been aware of at the time, or other people were not aware of at the time. I mean, I think Muhammad heard the word of God, and that's how
Correct.
the basis of Islam started. The interesting thing about Conan Doyle and his wife as well was she was a medium, or that's how it kind of led into that. She was a medium. I think they're one of the more interesting kind of stories in the United States, because a lot of these biblical stories seem to kind of be in, like, you know, long ago, olden times and whatnot, and seem to be so far distant from the American experience that we don't take them quite as seriously because we're the new world, but George Washington supposedly had an experience as well. It's one of those things that it's very, you know, it's become folklore, but it was written as as something that was factual immediately after his death. And I don't know that he ever claimed it, but people did claim that they'd heard him speak of it. It's something I would take with a huge grain of salt, but It just goes to show that this kind of receiving information this way is considered to be usually of great import.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. And I think most often, even for regular people, the information that comes through for a reason. It comes through and has some particular relevance to them, or something in some way connected to them or larger than them, but would mean something. Yeah. So, just as people who have done mediumship, you and I have personally served to help connect other people to people who've passed over. We've had our own spontaneous mediumship experiences, and we know a whole lot of mediums. And very often you or I or somebody else will say, I'm hearing, or they are saying that.
Right.
And just to clarify for people listening for whom this is new or not a personal experience, I think most often psychic communication comes through in a multimodal fashion, right? You might hear some things, feel some things, know some things, see some things.
Or all of those, right? So, or a sense that is not easily identifiable as one of the 5 or 8 senses that we acknowledge. So it's more like the totality of the experience that you have, but it can incorporate, all of those senses.
Yeah, 100%. And it's kind of like, just as a reference point for people listening, Kathy and I are having a conversation. We can see each other virtually, but we're not parsing out the different sensory input. Right. I'm seeing, hearing, thinking, associating things to, and so forth, while I'm listening to Kathy and speaking with her. And that's the same thing when the communications are psychic or the information is psychic. So, a lot of people say they hear their guides communicating, and actually after death communications are very common for people, especially when the loved one that's lost is close to them. And I'm saying after death, that's not the only way to receive clairaudient information, but I feel like that's a time when the information that comes through is very often clairaudient. So there's just to kind of give a little bit of a picture of who receives clairaudient information or what's going on with people in terms of psychic perception. There's a book by this gentleman, David Ritchie, and it's called The Hiss of the Asp. And the asp stands for anomalous asp. I don't know what's going on with me today. I think it's the heat. Asp stands for anomalously sensitive person. And what he means by that is he says that there are over 5 million people in the U.S. that are anomalous. anomalously sensitive people. And what he means by that is they have uncommonly high levels of specific sensitivities, not only in the emotional realm, I'm quoting from his book, but also in the physiological, cognitive, altered states of consciousness and transpersonal or metaphysical realms as well. And he's saying that this can manifest in different ways, not just psychic, but he's saying heightened sensory awareness if you're talking about a physiological way this can manifest or show itself. In the cognitive realm as a learning disorder or a genius, or both. In the emotional realm as emotional disorders, he's saying are heightened intrapersonal and interpersonal attunement. And in the altered states of consciousness realm as dissociative disorders, which is where you don't feel very connected to who you are, your life, or your body in the moment, or creativity. And in the transpersonal realm as extrasensory perception, otherwise known as ESP, psychokinesis, out-of-body experiences, trance channeling, and kundalini arousal, just to name a few. But he identifies in his book, I won't go into detail here, but a bunch of things that he sees as correlated with being particularly sensitive to these things. And clairaudience could very easily fall under those broad headings, including things like left-handedness or not totally brains, people who are ambidextrous and so forth, people who are very creative. But back to clairaudience, the things we hear clairaudiently are usually inside of our heads, not always. They often sound like your own voice or a neutral one. At least that's how it is for me. Sometimes they're more dramatic and appear to be outside of you. I think that's less common, but I think it happens. Not only voices saying something, but song lyrics, music, other environmental noises. And just as an example, it's like being at a place that used to have a train station and and train tracks. Now they may be long gone or overgrown and nobody knows they're there. But when you're there, you hear a train whistle and maybe it's loud, even though there's no train. That's an example to me of clairaudience if you didn't know there was a train there.
Right. Even if you do. I mean, when we talk about those distinctions and we say things like, evidentiary, or it's because as we're having these experiences or we're hearing about people who have these experiences, we're automatically defending ourselves against a skepticism, which I don't think is necessary for us at this point. People who are unwilling acknowledge that other people have experiences, truthfully, why waste your time trying to convince them? I can tell you I am no longer in a place where I care whether or not people are believe or don't believe, because every experience is uniquely yours, and you need your life to be what your life is going to be. And if your life is going to be a life 100%. Of no, that's okay. My life 100%. Is a life of constantly pushing back the boundaries and having more come into my world. But it's funny because I don't think it's necessary. I think even knowing we put these restrictions on people who are having experiences in phenomenon as if these restrictions somehow create a forensic, a laboratory where things become, repeatable. But at the end of the day, so much of human experiences, and I would argue the best of human experience is not repeatable, and it's not going to be repeatable. It's unique to you in the moment that you're in. And therefore, if you're standing at I'm going to drop a name here. I'm going to drop a TV show here. Actually, it's Adam's show. Adam was, Adam Berry. Adam Berry has a television show called Kindred Spirits, and his investigative partner on the show and his incredibly dear close friend, Amy Bruni, is a wonderful person and a great investigator. They were doing an episode, and they were at a train station, and how funny. People had been hearing this train, and the train had not been operational for years and years and years. And they went out to investigate the auditory experiences that people were having to see if they could have them. And as we were just talking, lots of times these experiences, they're not being broadcast. They're not being broadcast to anyone who can receive them. Sometimes they're originating and being broadcast specifically to you. You're the receiver. If someone's standing next to you, they're not necessarily going to get it. And Amy went out to this railroad crossing, and was trying to replicate the circumstances where people had heard this like lonesome train, and all of a sudden the tracks lit up and the bells and the whistles literally started happening, almost as if the added emphasis of the television and all of these things had kind of kicked this stuff up a notch. But they were investigating clairaudience experiences and then ended up having what I would consider to be kind of an anomalous electronic phenomena. But again, puts so much emphasis on defending these experiences against the skeptic. I think we give the skeptic too much power. And by skeptic, I don't mean honest skeptic, an unbeliever, someone who is unwilling to be convinced.
A person committed to having the same position regardless of any evidence.
Right. That's it. That it does not, it cannot because it cannot. So if you're just saying something can't, but you're not offering any evidence as to why it can't, you're a believer.
100%.
It's just as faith-based as anything else.
100%. Thank you for saying that. Totally, totally true. And it's funny because we're not going to talk about telepathy today necessarily, but
But we have it.
I watch almost no TV, and I don't know why. I don't know what I'm doing with my time, but I didn't see that episode. But I think it's funny that was such a vivid, now I have to see it. That was such a vivid experience and such high impact stuff going on. And, I'm thinking, train whistle.
And it's funny because television is television, but it was one of the few things that I saw on TV where when the skeptics came out about it, I actually waded in, usually I don't, but I waded in and I was just like, because she reacted to the sound and she's a seasoned investigator, but she's still a human being. She's still a human being standing on a railroad tracks at 3:00 in the morning. That was, that is not supposed to even have electricity to it. And all of a sudden everything starts going off. And so she screamed and people went after her because that she screamed. And I'm like, she's still a human being who got startled. It doesn't mean that she's afraid of the phenomena just because it was unexpected. But I do think it's interesting. And it's not the only difference that you and I have had in the last couple of, in the last few conversations. I think we had trains pop up in a couple of other places. I think we need to go on a train excursion.
We do. We need a haunted train.
Yeah.
100%. And you're giving me ideas for another episode for us because we both have stories about items that shouldn't suddenly start working, electronic items. And,
I have about 1 million of them in here right now.
So put that on the to-do list.
Yes.
You're talking about skeptics. And by the way, I don't think of scientists as, I'm going to call the skeptics that we're talking about non-believers because they're not true skeptics, committed non-believers, religious non-believers.
I actually call them believers.
Unbelievers.
Because they are unwilling.
Awesome.
And to me, if you're unwilling to have evidence, if you're unwilling for evidence to alter your thought, that's as much a dogma as any 100%. Other, so you're just as faith-based in your belief system as anyone else is.
100%, possibly more so. But, there has been some more research into, and I won't belabor it, but into clairaudient phenomena. And the reason I took a look at this, I was kind of doing a little bit of a search, is because, remember, I am a psychologist and I'm very well aware that the field still pathologizes psychic experiences for the most part, not all of the field. And I think that's shifting a little bit. But, often people will say, well, is it really clairaudience or is somebody just having some sort of psychotic experience, some sort of hallucinatory experience? So what I think is good is actually there is a little bit of a movement towards looking at things in a broader context, like a cultural context, a spiritual context, and so forth, because that gives us room to interpret people's experiences and allow them to interpret in a less pathological or non-pathological ways. There was this study, Hearing the Voice, this project in the UK by Dr. Adam J. Powell and Dr. Peter Moseley at Northumbria University. just to give you a quick overview, they looked at 65 mediums and asked them about their clairaudient experiences. One thing that's not surprising is that these were spiritualist mediums. Spiritualism is a specific type of spiritual approach, mediumship and survival of consciousness after death, very much a very overt part of spiritualism. But they said that over 44% of the spiritualist mediums in their sample reported clairaudient experiences on a daily basis. So every day having some sense of hearing, of psychic hearing.
Right.
And 75% of the people who had those daily experiences also reported daily clairvoyant experiences. So it wasn't just psychic hearing, it was psychic seeing and more. But what they found is that the trait of absorption, being able to be absorbed in something, really intensely focused on something, was linked to having more of these types of experiences. And what's interesting is that as somebody who does hypnosis, absorption is something that allows us to have perceptual experiences that are, hypnotic perceptual experiences, hypnotically induced perceptual experiences. That's a thing. So you can actually help somebody who's very highly hypnotically suggestible, in a good way. I want people to think of this as an adaptive trait. You have the ability to use hypnosis to your advantage if you want. While that's maybe 10 or 15% of the population, but you can help somebody to generate a sensory experience because their brains are cooperating with that suggestion. So it's interesting that there's an overlap between the ability to be immersed in an experience, which again, we know we can generate one that isn't actually happening. It's happening in your mind. A high ability to be absorbed in something was common in these mediums who had clairaudient experiences. But again, like you were saying, there's something evidentiary about clairaudient experiences, right? We don't have access to the information another way, and then it's verifiable often later on. I wanted to point out a few more things. Again, along those lines, understanding that we agree that people don't need this. Some people do and some people don't. You were talking about more contemporary experiences, right? Because you were talking about big things like Joan of Arc or Muhammad.
Right.
But, there's been research also with contemporary Christians, I think probably more devoutly religious end of the spectrum, I imagine, but people who claim to hear God and don't think this is a big deal. Basically, I think there was a study comparing contemporary Christians who hear voices with spiritualists.
Well, do you think, Traci, though, is that interpretation? So if the voices are coming in, or whatever it is, the sounds are coming in, we're then interpreting it, right? So if you're a person of Christian faith, you're going to interpret it through the kind of Christian dogma, the Christian lexicon. If you're a person of Islamic faith, you're going to do that. If you're a person of Buddhist faith, you're going to do that. Does that, that's still interpretation versus
100%. Right. And that's where we want to be thoughtful about honoring people's cultural and spiritual context for having these experiences. It's interesting because a contemporary, more recent example, I don't think it's the only one, but again, the religious Christians, there's a subset that believes very much that God can communicate directly with them. If I get this wrong, please feel free to note this in the comments. I don't consider myself a religious expert by any means, but Mike Pence, I remember it made news. This was years ago, felt that God had communicated to him directly. I think that the place where I start to myself notice my own skepticism is, okay, well, if 2 people or 3 people or 5 people are saying God has communicated directly with them and they're getting contradictory messages, then it's kind of like, all right, now I don't really, know exactly how to interpret that.
Well, I would interpret that as their God.
Or his experience.
Not the God, like the idea that I mean, we all have, and there's lots of faiths where deities are more personal than they are omnipotent. And so, somebody might interpret anything that comes in that way as being from God, especially if you agree with it, especially if it's kind of, he might have gotten two calls that day. Yeah. He might have gotten two calls that day. One might have been, counterproductive to what he wanted. And that one didn't get reported. And then one was, I mean,
I don't know.
And I do think, I'm not making any statements about it. I'm just that's what we're talking about when we say that it comes down to interpretation, because there's lots of people who would say, I was having lunch with somebody the other day and she said, oh, I'm clairaudient and I hear these things all the time. And I understood what she meant. She interpreted it as her higher guide, as literally an entity that she has a relationship with, who communicates with her in that way. And
so her higher self.
Well, she would not say her higher self. Okay. She would say this is a separate entity from her. Okay. Someone that's an assigned guide within the middle management or whatever. I might think it's her higher self. I might think it's her unconscious or her subconscious. I might think it's, some other thing. But that's not how she interprets it. She also didn't interpret it as God. She was just like, this is a person, and she would say it was a person. This is a person who essentially I work hand in hand with, okay, and this is how we communicate. And a non-corporeal being, and this is how we communicate. I always think of clairaudience as being much more literal in my experience, where I'm in a situation and then I specifically hear something. But mine is much more rigid, I think, and it's largely because I don't afford it the opportunity to be other than that. So I'm comfortable with it within the confines of this, setting, and, not in other settings. And so it doesn't happen to me in other settings.
So I'm having some thoughts, as I often do. Something I wanted to mention, again, if we're not looking at trying to prove anything, or if we're not looking at, we're just saying, okay, this came through, it's meaningful to me. So right. Personal meaning would be something that I would say, somebody can be mentally healthy and have clairaudient experiences. Some of the things common to people who have clairaudient or other psychic experiences. And you'd say, well, how do we know that that's healthy versus, hallucinatory? Some of the research has shown that having a sense of personal agency, so not feeling like, oh, the voice is coming in telling me to do something.
Right.
That it's personally meaningful and it's usually helpful. That there's a context where it might be relevant to something that's going on for the person and sheds light on something. And to be honest, completely, like, I don't care whether it's somebody's own subconscious that's worked something out and comes through in a way that just happens to be more creative or different from maybe somebody else's thought process, or whether it's genuine psychic communication. Oftentimes, most of the time, I don't think it's really going to matter. So the other thing is I wanted to give an example of where I had a very vivid clairaudient experience, and I got not only immediate verification, but then a different type of meaning out of it later, if I may.
Of course.
This is deeply personal. This is a deeply personal experience. And I've shared this before, on other podcasts, and I've shared it again on my blog recently, because I think it's important for people to understand what these experiences can be like. And I have a audio program that just came out on Clairaudience. I don't do these things because it's going to buy me a Rolls Royce. It probably won't.
It will not.
I don't need to be psychic to know it's probably not going to result in that.
The spirits are telling me it will not.
It will not. I do it because I think this is a natural ability that we all have, and it's worth developing and paying attention to. So many years ago, when I was a graduate student, many years ago now, when I was a graduate student, I used to do energy healing weekly on a friend of mine who was also another student, but she had a serious but not life-threatening health problem. but it was highly uncomfortable understatement. And so between classes, when we both had some time, we would look for an empty room where I could work on her for a bit. And she very much appreciated that. And it was nice to be able to do that for her. So because the school was in New York City, which is notoriously tight on space pretty much everywhere, one day we couldn't find a space. And so after much searching, we went to a floor in the building that was vacant because it was slated for demolition and a complete renovation. But the demolition hadn't started yet. So no one else was up there. We weren't supposed to be up there. We found a classroom and she laid down on the table. I'm going to call her Sarah for this example rather than use her name. Sarah laid down on a very uncomfortable table in the room and I worked on her. And I was working on her, I don't know, maybe 10 minutes. I don't remember exactly. And I'm feeling, as I usually do, what's going on in her body, and I'm getting images about that. And then I hear loud, booming music. And it is the Beatles song, Let It Be. And it sounded like Paul McCartney singing, but it was the same two lines over and over and over again. And it felt like it was coming through a loudspeaker. It was obnoxiously loud. So I'm like, what the hell is going on? Like, very distracting. But I'm thinking, I hope this is going to turn off soon. And I'm just working on her. I didn't know, I don't even know why it's only the same two lines, but it's let it be, let it be, let it be, let it be. Whisper words of wisdom, let it be, let it be. Then Mother Mary, come to me, not comes, which is actually how the song goes. I know now. Let it be, let it be. So I'm like, all right. But after several minutes, I'm thinking, this is so distracting. I'm so distracted. For some reason, Sarah she looks deeply asleep. I have no idea how she's tuning out this noise. So I step away and I go to the door and I look in the hallway to see who the hell is blasting this music. Because now I want to give them a piece of my mind because they weren't supposed to be up there. We weren't supposed to be up there, but I was going to tell them.
But they certainly weren't.
They really weren't, At least we were quietly interloping, if that's a word. So I go into the hallway and the music stops. You may know where this is going. So I go back into the room. I start working on Sarah again, and then the music starts up again. And it is unbelievable. But I work on her for like another 15 minutes or so, 20 minutes, whatever. As I'm working on her, I'm trying to just ignore the music and get into the zone. And in my mind's eye, very clearly, I see a young woman. She looked like she was like maybe like 20s to me, pretty hair, just a very pretty, kind woman. I could feel her kindness. And she was just kind of off to the side. And she's in a rural setting that doesn't look familiar to me. And I'm like, oh, okay. And when I'm done, Sarah was open to these things and she asked me what I noticed. And I told her what I noticed in her body and what I thought she should do and what it meant to me. And then, I kind of sheepishly told her about the woman and the music, and she starts to cry. And now I'm like, oh my God, and she said, oh my God, today is the 10-year anniversary of my friend Mary's passing. And I met her when we were in Ecuador for a year. And, she died, unexpectedly in her late 20s. And she was like a mentor to me. All day I've been thinking, I don't know if she's still here for me. So now I'm thinking of the words, whisper words of wisdom, let it be. And Mother Mary, come to me. My hair's standing up every time I've told anybody this, and it's years later. So I thought, okay, this was for Sarah to hear because she needed to know that Mary's still alive in some version and that she's still there for her.
Right.
Now, what neither of us knew at the time, my hair's standing up like crazy, is that a few years later, Sarah was diagnosed with a terminal illness and wound up passing, at age 40. So it took me a few years. I still couldn't reconcile with how this person had gone through so much. And then, yeah. So one day at my dining room table and I'm working and it's probably evening and I get an email from Sarah's friend. I'm going to call him Danny. And he sends me out of the blue. We haven't connected in years. A video of Sarah singing Let It Be to her then toddler daughter. And I think that Mary knew Sarah was going to go through this. I think we didn't yet, but I think the whole point of this was to remind me as well,
right,
that Sarah was okay and
yeah, a
eternal.
link in that chain, right? You became a link in that chain,
right? Because the clairaudient information, largely clairaudient, some clairvoyant, but wasn't for me initially. But ultimately, I think it was, and
right?
as
Because
well.
you were a participant of it. You then became a part of that story. I mean,
So verification, I think, can help us feel not crazy. You know what I mean? Or
right,
not like we're just making this thing up. And had I not shared that with Sarah, and had she not said, "Oh my God, it's so important," and for anybody who's listening, saying, "Well, she was your friend, maybe you knew," but I didn't know about Mary, never heard about Mary. As much as I love this close friend of mine, like I only saw her when we were in school together for the most part, and it just didn't come up.
right. And I think, again, I think that, to me, even if you had, it would still be a meaningful and, evidentiary experience. And I don't know that 20 years ago, I would have felt the same way. But having done this for as long as I've done it now, I am absolutely less rigid in my acknowledgement and acceptance of things as evidence. And I like to say there's no proof. There's evidence. You throw it into one pile or the other, and eventually it's going to tip one way or the other. And for me, I've had enough of those experiences that you're talking about that, that when it happens and you feel it, to me, that's enough now. Right. I was having this conversation with somebody earlier today where, I said, no, I had a dream about my father last night, and my father's been dead for 27 years, and I cannot recollect the last time I dreamt about him. I can't, and it wasn't something that commonly happened to me. I didn't dream about him a lot after he passed away. But the times that I did dream about him, it was always kind of like, what are you doing here? You're dead. You're not supposed to be, and he was like, no, I'm not dead. I actually, I was in Kalamazoo or something like that. And so it was always this kind of like, what are you doing here? You're not supposed to be here kind of thing. But last night, it wasn't. Last night, it was like, oh no, I know. And I did pass away, but I'm, essentially checking in and visiting. And I hadn't remembered that I had the dream until I was having this conversation with this gentleman today. And as I was telling him that's so weird, you just reminded me of something that I had this dream, and I'm glad I remembered it because it was like getting to visit my dad again. He said, I had a dream about my mother, and today is the anniversary of her passing. It was like one of those things where these weird little circumstances led to these other kind of, revelatory things. And, maybe it was a dream. Maybe it was, but like, it was more meaningful. It doesn't matter what happened to you. I accept it, and I accept your interpretation of it. I don't just accept it. I agree with your interpretation of it. Right. And I think that that's what people who have these experiences, that's what we're looking for, right? That's what we want. We don't want you to say, oh, it's good that you think that. Oh yeah, no, it's okay. I'm okay with you thinking that, because there's something about that that's implying that maybe I don't know, being foolish or misrepresenting something. Whereas the difference between someone saying, I accept what you say happened, and saying, I agree with your interpretation, is that, no, I think you had an experience. I think you had an experience that is beyond the norm. It's not a common experience. And I think that we as individuals know when it is. Like I always say to people, you've probably heard me say this to people a million times, when it's the cat. You 100% know when that door creaked, when it was the cat, right?
And when it wasn't.
And when it wasn't, right? You may blame the cat, but in your heart, you know it. And I think that you had otherworldly experience, an experience that was beyond the common experience that we have in the strictly physical world that we're in, because we're not in a strictly physical world, right? But we live a lot of our lives in it. I had a similar experience with we both lost very close friends around very much around the same time. And what a lot of people are very fortunate to not realize is that when you lose a friend that you've known for many, many years, you lose a perspective on your life, like you lose a witness to your life. And, that's like for yourself, but then you also lose this person and you see the options and the opportunities that this person lost. And sometimes you can become lost in that. But I had a very unusual auditory experience. I don't know if I ever shared this with you.
I don't know.
I might have. But I do think someone else heard it. My friend had passed away, had been a little bit under a year. And you knew me at the time. You knew it was absolutely devastating. And I know you were going through something very similar at the time. And I was laying in bed and my dog was next to me, my dog Seamus, who has since passed away. And I heard what sounded like a radio being tuned in, like an old fashioned like radio being tuned in. And I remember sitting up in the bed and being like, and I remember Seamus sitting up in the bed and looking around. And my partner was downstairs and I wasn't asleep. And I heard a very faint voice saying, hello, hello. And I responded. And even at the time, I was like, what is this? Like, I've studied this. I've never heard of anything like this before, And I heard my friend's voice and she said, can you hear me? Can you hear me? And I said, I can hear you. Can you hear me? And she was like, yes, I hear you. So it was very much like original cell phone kind of thing.
Thomas Edison.
And I said, are you okay? And she said, I'm getting better. They're taking care of me. Oh, and she'd been gone for almost a year. And she said, I'm getting better. They're taking care of me. She had a very difficult passing. And I said, do you know how much we love you? And she said, yeah, I love you too. And then she goes, please tell my mom I'm okay, which was so her. It was, you know what I mean? And then she was like, I gotta go. But it was very much like this, like I'm broadcasting this, hoping you'll pick it up. And it just so happened. But I remember what got me was I looked over and the dog was really like, are you hearing this? What is that? Dogs don't, they're not manufacturing evidence, but
not that dog.
Yeah, well, certainly not Seamus. But I mean, like those are those strange experiences that we have that somebody from the outside can look at and say, well, you were obviously asleep. And that's a very common thing for people to say. And it's like, well, listen, if you were looking for her social security number or lottery numbers, or, you're never going to get that. But
Most
I
likely.
know, unless you're Bill, one of the psychics that used to work here who did. For me, I have come to trust and accept my interpretation of things. And because I know when I've misread something and I know when something is beyond what I would consider a common experience or an paranormal experience. And I fully accept that. And I don't think these experiences have to be big Hollywood blockbusters. I think they're subtle. Yeah. I think, and I think it's the subtleness of them. It's the finesse of them that really makes them different, that really kind of leaves a mark on you. So I would say that you had a very layered experience, that I think probably resonated in lots of different parts of your life.
Oh my God, definitely. Definitely. And my last thing, sorry, this is just a tangent from what you said about Seamus hearing the voice of your friend. This is just a quick aside. I don't know if we'll even keep this in the episode, but I, a million years ago, during a heat wave, somewhat like we're having now, the power went out in my apartment and I had my two little dogs and, it was Cleo and Morty at the time, and I couldn't leave them in the apartment.
Your dogs have the best names, by the way.
Thank you. It's all from the same retirement home. Always. But we could not leave them, and the apartment was stifling. So I drove the 35 minutes, 40 minutes out to my parents' house, who had working air conditioning, and I brought the dogs there. Now, So at some point, I'll talk about how haunted my house was growing up. Scared the crap out of me, probably set me on this path somewhat. But I don't know where I think my parents were out at work at the time. So I am in this, I got to describe this better, but you walk in the entryway. It's like a 1970s colonial. And on the left is the living room with these French doors. And for some reason, the dogs and I were in that living room for a minute with the doors closed. But the stairwell to the second floor, always I had heard footsteps walking back and forth in that house growing up and other things. But then you leave and you move out and you're an adult and you're like, well, was that real? Even though I heard it all the time. So P.S., I hear the same heavy rhythmic footsteps walking across the hallway upstairs. Cleo and Morty look up and I know that they hear it. And I had to go to work and I was like, all right, well, bye dogs. Like, and I left. You just ignore it. And I left, but I can't believe I left in there, but they made it. But I figured it would have been worse to be with no air conditioning, but they heard it. Right. And Morty used to notice things in my other apartment like that. I was like, oh my God, you notice it too.
Yeah, well, the dogs hear it here. You know what I mean? They definitely react to things that happen in the tower. And I don't think that it's like this heightened sense that animals have. I mean, I think they do have that. I just think that they don't have the skepticism. So It's like, I heard something, what was that? You know, and I think that they're just, you know, they're going to stand in front of that closet door until you open it, you know, and
I know.
And I like, there are certain things I do trust my gut, but I definitely trust my dogs.
Oh my God, totally. I think that's a good place for us to wrap up here. Everyone, let us know what you think. Have you had an experience of clairaudience, psychic hearing? What do you think? Does it make sense to you? Does it not? Share some of your experiences or your pets' experiences for that matter. Kathy, thanks so much for being with me again today. It's so great to see you.
Good to see you too, Tracy.
And until next time, of course, be well. We'll see you on the next episode of Curious Explorers.
Take care, everybody.
If you've enjoyed this episode of Curious Explorers, please do remember to like, share, follow, leave us a comment. Tell us what you think, what you'd like us to explore next time, and share. Have you had any similar experiences yourself? We want to know. Remember, you can always catch the episodes on all your favorite streaming platforms. You can follow us on Instagram at Curious Explorers Show, on Facebook at the Curious Explorers Podcast, and on YouTube, where we'll always have a little bit of extra content and visuals on at Curious Explorers Show. And until next time, stay curious.